everyone. Happy Thursday. Welcome to today's webinar, Building Equity in Technology. My name is Emily Scahill. I'm the Manager of Public Education and Awareness at Mental Health America's National Office, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. A few notes before I introduce our presenters today. This webinar is being recorded and will be emailed out to all registrants within 1 week along with the slides, so don't stress about getting all of your notes down. We do not offer CEUs, but if you'd like a certificate of attendance, we have a form for you to request one. I'll post the link to that form in the chat shortly, and it'll be included in our follow-up email as well. And last but not least, we've built in some time for a Q&A. So please post your questions in the chat box throughout the presentation. We'll go through some at the end, and feel free to make comments or share some of your knowledge in there as well. And now I'm so excited to introduce today's presenters. First, we have Wendy Chisholm, is a principal accessibility architect at Microsoft, where she leads AI for Accessibility, a program aimed to accelerate the development of accessible AI solutions that amplify human capability for people living with a disability. We also have Dr. Desmond Patton, founding director of the SAFE Lab and co-director of the Justice, Equity, and Technology Lab at Columbia School of Social Work, and a leading pioneer in the field of making AI empathetic, culturally sensitive, and less biased. And last but not least, we have Teresa Nguyen, Mental Health America's Chief Program Officer and Vice President of Research and Innovation, where she works to improve access to mental health care through data and digital-based innovations. We're so excited to have the three of them with us today, and now I'll turn it over to Wendy to get us started.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I'm very excited to be here, especially to be here with Teresa and Desmond, who are two of my favorite co-conspirators. And so what I'm going to share some about is the AI for Accessibility program that I'm a part of. My role in AI for Accessibility is to help determine for our grant program, it's a $25 million 5-year grant program. My job is to actually figure out what we're going to fund, what our strategy is, and to manage our portfolio. And so I'm super excited that both Teresa and Desmond are here, because they're both folks that I've been able to help amplify and support, which I really think is the beauty of this program. We're really empowering people to do good stuff. So next slide, please. And AI for Accessibility at Microsoft is one of our AI for Good programs. And so all of these programs are working to give resources and support and platforms to people who are doing really good stuff in the world, whether that's accessibility, and that's empowering people with disabilities, which is my space. But there's also AI for Earth, which is looking at sustainability, AI for humanitarian action, AI for cultural heritage, and AI for health. Next slide, please. So Microsoft in general has just announced our upped ambition as it relates to accessibility. So we've just announced for the next 5 years how we're going to really try to shift what is called the disability divide. And what the divide is, it's this gap in inclusion for people with disabilities. And we see this around the world, that in terms of employment, before the pandemic in the United States, the employment rate for people with disabilities was half that for people without. And in some other countries, you know, up to 80% of people with disabilities may be unemployed or underemployed. And a lot of this starts with education and stigma, and just not having the resources to get the education and the skills to get the employment. There's also access to technologies. And so our strategy includes a variety of pillars to really shift that. And it's becoming even more important, because while 1 billion people in the world have disabilities, those numbers are growing. You know, COVID created a bunch of long haulers where you have people living with sustained impacts to their health and their abilities. But also mental health conditions have really increased for a variety of reasons. And I think especially in the United States, we've seen a variety of contributions to that, from COVID and the isolation to all the impacts that have been happening with social justice, the continuing uh, impacts of racism. And, you know, many of these systemic intersections right now are really impacting people with disabilities. So today I'll be focusing specifically on investments around mental health, but Microsoft in general has a variety of, we're investing to help this digital divide, to lessen the digital divide. My focus today will be on one aspect of that with the AI for Accessibility program. So we're within this larger context, but the work that's going on is actually pretty exciting and necessary. Next slide, please. So to focus on AI for accessibility, and especially about the equity and what we've learned, we're in the 4th year of our program. And, you know, the biggest issue is just the lack of data and the biases that are in the data that we've seen, especially as it relates to people with disabilities, but in our larger context too, just the lack of diversity in that data. And so part of the problem is that because people with disabilities may not have access to education and to employment, there's less of a way to collect that data to, you know, for looking at employment scenarios, people with disabilities are underemployed and therefore they're underrepresented in employment data. And then when you train algorithms on that data, those models are going to be biased. And we're also seeing that even if we do have the data, the way that models are often trained, they're looking for patterns. And if you don't have enough data to become a pattern, you're going to end up getting kind of trained out of the data and the models. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about how to improve these systems. And what I spend a lot of my time thinking about is who can I fund to help balance some of this work? Who can create these data sets? Who can create these models? And what are really the barriers and the opportunities that communities of people with disabilities are seeing and need? And so what we really try to do is fund projects that are built by and with the disability community, because it's these teams of people and this representation of being at the table involved in the process that not only makes these innovations fair and equitable, it actually is where we have seen this beautiful history of innovation. Because I'll share one example. OXO Good Grips, it's a, you know, these are kitchen utensils, but they were designed for a woman who has arthritis, but they're easier for everyone to use. And that's often what you see in innovations for people with disabilities. It can impact all of us. And I'm saying this as a person with a disability. I live with PTSD, so this is very personal for me. Next slide, please. So we are a 5-year, $25 million program. As I said, we're in our 4th year. And our sole purpose is to empower people who are building good things and to give them a platform with technology grants and other ways that we can uplift them, and then tell their stories and help to inspire other innovations and to help share in conversations like this where we can see some of the patterns that we've had. Next slide, please. We have 4 areas of focus: education, employment, community, and home. And so today, community is what we're focused on. Mental health kind of fits in there, although it shows up everywhere. Next slide, please. And really the challenge is, as I've said, mental health is one of the top causes of disability in the world. It's growing. And in many countries, you may only have one mental health professional for 1,000 people or 100,000 people. And so one of my funding priorities is that I don't want to fund projects that will make decisions for people. I want to help people make smarter decisions. And so our opportunities involve funding ideas that will help people connect with each other and to deepen, because we've seen that wellness and well-being, connection is so important to that. And so there are many platforms that can help people connect with each other. And so where can we help? but also where can we help people on that journey towards overcoming the stigma associated with finding help and finding those resources that they really need. So let me talk about a couple of the projects that we funded and some of the work we've done. So next slide. One of them is at University of Washington, and it's kind of like a grammar checker but for empathy. So imagine a platform like Talkspace where you have peers supporting each other, and someone may not be very empathetic or may not really know how to give an empathetic response. This project can help you, or the results of this project can actually help you kind of, here's a more empathetic way to say that. It's actually really cool. And I'm excited to see this one get deployed because I think the implications for this can be used in a lot of different venues. Twitter maybe. Next slide, please. This one I'm not going to say too much about because Teresa, I'm hoping we'll talk more about this one, but this is a project between Mental Health America and Northwestern, and I'm very excited about this one. We've recently just renewed this one for another year, and so I'll just skip past that. And finally, when we did our initial call for proposals for mental health projects back in February of 2020, right before the pandemic, or right as the pandemic was starting, our request had a few themes, and one of them was intersectionality. Unfortunately, we didn't fund projects that were specifically looking at intersectionality of mental health. And through the process of reviewing and building a team of experts to help me make the decisions and funding, I learned so much more about the lack of diversity in the data related to mental health, but also even in just the lack of diversity in the research that mental health diagnoses are based on, and about all the misdiagnoses that happen specifically in Black and African American communities, and the variety of stigma related to Asian communities as well. So to explore this further, we talked with Desmond, and so I'm really glad that he's here today too to talk more about his work, because he was absolutely fundamental in bringing together a workshop that Teresa then spoke at. And we just for 2 days really explored the social determinants of mental health and access to health, how racism impacts mental health. And from that, we produced a report. And it has also influenced some of our funding. We've funded a project with Howard that is just getting kicked off. And I'm excited to be working with Desmond this year on a design justice course at Columbia. So please take a look at the report and the video recordings that we have from that workshop. I continue to learn, and I continue to know that there's more for me personally on my own anti-racism journey, and how as a funder I can help influence and help make sure that we're funding more equitable projects, or projects that will bring more equity into this space. Next slide. So one of our criteria, or our selection criteria, we have a variety of things. One of the most important things is that we're funding projects developed with or by people with disabilities. But the other piece is looking at the design justice questions, which have become fundamental in at least my thinking, in terms of, asking the 3 questions: who benefits from a model, or who's going to benefit from the work, the output of the work, who contributes, and who's potentially harmed. And so really understanding each of these, and then also, reading Weapons of Math Destruction and all of that, and making sure that any proxies or any data that we're collecting is actually a very good measurement and going to promote the right kind of behaviors and changes in anything that we're seeing. So the selection process we have is very rigorous, and we tend not to fund very many projects because we really become partners with the people that we fund. We meet often, we have relationships, and we really want these projects that we've selected to be successful. So next slide, please. So I really encourage you to join us. Please learn more about the program, aka.ms/AI numeral 4A is our short link to our website. You can apply for a grant at aka.ms/grant. And I encourage you, like I said, to look at our report from the mental health workshop, and that also then links to Desmond's blog and all of the videos, including Teresa's presentation and just all the great presentations that we had. Our upcoming award, we are right in the middle of our employment round. I'm just reviewing applications right now. But this fall, we're going to try something new. We're going to have a round that is not focused on AI, but is focused on assistive technology, and specifically outside of the United States. With that, I am going to hand it off to Desmond. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Wendy. It's a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. I'm Desmond Patton, and I'm on faculty at the School of Social Work at Columbia University. And I've had just a wonderful time working with Wendy, and had the opportunity to meet Teresa in her innovative talk just last year. I'm happy to share with you some of my work, and in particular, work that thinks about or considers the intersections of grief and trauma, social media, and artificial intelligence. This particular set of slides will be on a study that I conducted with colleagues in computer science to understand how young Black youth in the city of Chicago are leveraging social media to grieve, and how the interpretation of grief and the application of AI tools can create some challenges with how we use this in the real world. Next slide. So I direct this thing called the Safe Lab. We are a research group at Columbia University where social workers and computer scientists and psychologists and community members and young people all that hope to use social media as a neighborhood, to look at it as the new neighborhood, an environmental context that can help us understand our society in new, nuanced, and complicated ways. And we have been using social media as a neighborhood and applying AI to study issues of well-being for the last 8 years. Next slide. So my motivation is twofold. I did my PhD at the University of Chicago, and I've been studying youth and gun violence for many years at this point. And during my PhD program, I was particularly interested in how young Black and Latinx young boys and men were navigating violence in the city of Chicago. But the reality is that it was not random that violence in the city of Chicago was located in the south and west sides of the city, where these neighborhoods are predominantly Black and Latinx. The public health problem of gun violence in Chicago has ebbed and flowed over the years. It is in a resurgence at this point, but as you can see, the pockets are very much connected to racialized spaces. Next slide. And at the same time, concurrently, young people are spending an enormous amount of time on social media, more than ever, where social media is life. Wake up in the morning, social media. You go to school, social media. End of night, social media. And so you have this confluence of issues, right, where gun violence is a predominant issue. It is the issue. It is the most scariest thing that's happening in community. And you're also living your life through social media. And so these two things come together, where young people are now expressing what's happening in the neighborhoods. They're also talking about people that they have issues with on social media. And these all become the triggers for online arguments that become offline violence. Next slide. And so in around 2011, 2012, I'm working with these young folks in Chicago, and they're telling me lots and lots of information about how they're using Twitter and Facebook and Instagram to navigate safety in their neighborhood. And so I was really fascinated by their capacity to use it in this way, and I went to the literature to really understand what's happening with the use of social media and gun violence. And there was no literature, particularly from a domestic standpoint at that time. And so with colleagues, we developed a paper called Internet Banging, where we put some conceptual terms and definitions around this new and unintended use of social media that was evolving right before our eyes. Next slide. And so what has happened, as I've said, is that we have this merging of worlds where most folks my age or older have been thinking about our world in terms of virtual world and offline world. But as we're seeing with this new use of social media and how it's being used, that the posting behavior is mapping onto streets and intersections and gang territories and lines that are invisible as well. Next slide. And so I have long been interested in the impact of social media as an amplifier for gun violence. But what I had missed in my early conceptualization of what this project could be is the why, the purpose, the goal, and in digging deeper into the lives of young people, particularly in the city of Chicago, it became clear that the starting point was something different, that perhaps young people were using social media as a promotive tool to cope with complex trauma and grief as they were navigating navigating those experiences in their neighborhood. Next slide. And this young woman is really the key to my new understanding of how this works. This is Jakaira Barnes. I learned about her life in April of 2014, the month she was murdered just steps from her house in the Woodlawn neighborhood of Chicago. Jakaira had a mythology on Twitter. She was known as the gun-toting gang girl of Chicago. She was known as KI, and she was also known as a shooter or hitter in her Southside gang. She became famous because she was compared to Little Snoop, the character from The Wire, for those of you who are familiar with that show. The mythology that was described on Twitter was that by the time she was 17 years old, she had shot or killed up to 20 people. None of that has been proven to be true, and she never spent any time in jail or prison as it relates to those crimes, but that is what that was the conversation that was online and offline. I was interested in her because she spent so much time on Twitter. She had almost 5,000 followers, 27,000 tweets. So at the time in 2014, this put her in the 95th percentile of Twitter users. So she left this long and complex and deep and robust Twitter life online that I wanted to understand. Initially, I had hoped to figure out how her posting behavior might be a predictive tool for offline violence. That was the wrong question. That was the wrong pursuit. In part because my understanding of Jakaira, how I thought about her in those early days, were clouded by my own biases, my own imbibing of toxic culture and pathologizing language and narratives about young Black girls. And so what Jakaira did in depth through her Twitter profile is that she forced me to reckon with those biases and to think about her life in a more complicated way, in a more nuanced way, in a more humanizing way. That's what she did through language, through tweets, through posting, through emojis in her Twitter profile. Next slide, please. And so this is an example of the type of engagement that Jakaira left, right? And so what she did is that she provided a really unique timeline of her history of trauma and grief. And then she also indicated through emoji how these feelings were being amplified in her everyday life. Jakaira experienced more grief, more trauma than most of us were experiencing in a lifetime, but she was hyper vulnerable about this grief and this pain on social media. Next slide. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was to do a deeper analysis qualitatively of the text and the language. And then we wanted to be able to create a data set, because there were no data sets, that included and centered Jakaira's life in her Twitter network, right? So we started with her as the central node or patient zero, and then we scraped the Twitter profiles that are public of individuals that were her top communicators, folks that she had the most conversations with, the most replies with over a year period. Next slide. But there were a couple of complications. Number one, none of the data science tools or artificial tools could work on this data set. They had no understanding of African-American vernacular English or the ways in which young people use social media in terms of how they speak on social media. And there was just lots of context and culture that was important and critical to unpacking, to making sure that we weren't mislabeling or misinterpreting posts. And so one of the things that we did is that we created a methodology called CASM, which is the contextual analysis of social media, where we focus on centering culture and context and nuance in social media posts, and we partner with domain experts, young people from the community, in order to help us translate and interpret those posts. And so at any labeling process that we engage in, we wanted to make sure that we were picking up important clues that would perhaps be misunderstood or overlooked in a traditional labeling process. Next slide. These are our domain experts. So the intersectional piece of this is that we not only need to understand the language, but we need to understand the community. We need to understand how young people think about these issues, and we need to understand the impact of doing this type of work. What impact could that have on the community? And so we hired young people from Chicago and New York City to help us unpack and think through the translation, the interpretation, and how this type of research might affect the community. Next slide. And so in our first paper on this particular topic, we were able to identify clues of acute grief. Here we see a post from Jakaira Barnes, who is very reactionary about the loss of a very good friend who was allegedly shot and killed by the Chicago police. Next slide. We also saw lots of anger and retaliation, but here is the interesting piece. There's one way in which we can interpret anger and retaliation as being distinct from grief, as being a threatening behavior that has nothing to do with processing complex trauma. Or you can consider anger and retaliation as being an important and critical step in the grieving process. We saw lots of comments from Jakaira that expressed anger and retaliation, but what are the different ways in which we could interpret this post? And is there a way in which we can interpret this post that if Jakaira were alive, we could have intervened or supported her in a different way? Next slide. Adaptation, we also saw Jakaira really working to remember and to memorialize her friend that was murdered. This is a different friend that was murdered much earlier in Jakaira's life, but just years later, up until she died, she was continuously talking about this individual and memorializing their life and really trying to keep them a part of her own memory and the collective memory on her Twitter network. Next slide. And then accepting the reality of death. This particular post has been haunting me since Jakaira's death, because this is the post that this is one of the last posts Jakaira made before she was murdered on April 11th, right? So the idea that Jakaira had accepted her own death and made this a public statement was one that continues to haunt other work that I do today. Next slide. And so we have decided to then label all that data and apply it to the data set using an automatic tool called natural language processing. Next slide. Some of the important features that this tool is able to do is that it's able to identify patterns in speech. So things like RIP were important for predicting grief, and things like free were emblematic of individuals talking about the loss of an individual who went to jail or prison. Next slide. I think that the use of social media and AI offers opportunities and challenges that we need to think through. I think that generally social media should be considered a place where many people are processing complex trauma and grief over their life, and that we need to think about this as a neighborhood, as an environment that people are living their lives in. There's no longer these discrete and disparate spaces. I think social media has the potential to do good if we ask better questions of social media, and if we engage in intersectional thinking and critical race thinking about how we're making meaning of posts, the biases and frameworks that we bring to the table when we're trying to make meaning of what's happening on social media. And I think that being able to pair qualitative thinking, clinical thinking with computational approaches could lead to better intervention and prevention work. And so this, in a nutshell, is exactly linked to the work that Wendy is proposing. I'm excited to continue this thinking and these approaches within our human-centered design course called Design Justice that we'll be kicking off this fall. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Teresa here. I'm going to finish us off in this presentation. And then certainly if anybody has any questions for Wendy or Desmond, please feel free to start gathering them in the chat box, and then we'll make sure to leave plenty of time at the end to answer any questions you all have. What I'm going to share with you today is some of MHA's work around AI and mental health and building technology around co-designed processes, and what we see as part of our work to bring together a lot of the vision that Wendy brings to the table, and learning from people like Desmond around how we can use technology to build better supports for community. For Mental Health America, this work started for us around our MHA screening program. So in 2014, as a part of advocating for ubiquitous mental health screens in society, we wanted to go where we know youth are at. And this was in an online space. At that time, when we were doing some research on looking something up like, I see ghosts, or am I stressed or depressed, we knew that kids were getting sent to ghosthunters.com, or just there wasn't content online, and certainly nothing was being done around ubiquitous mental health screens. So we launched MHA Screening, and at that time we only had 4 screens. A lot of people came. We were surprised. The internet was super cool. Since then, we were for many years screening about 1 million people a year. 2020, because of COVID and some work MHA was doing, we actually screened 2.5 million people in 2020. And then this year, it looks like our data is increasing to about 5 million a year, and in part because of the increase in the number of our US market, and also an increase in our international market, which means that we're now screening people from all over the world, which is really interesting for us. What we know as part of this is that 73% of our screeners are female. They're struggling with depression, increasing numbers of people who are taking other multiple screens, really revealing how intersectional mental health issues are. So people don't normally struggle with one condition, as many of us who live with mental health conditions know. 50% identify as another race or ethnicity. It used to be the case that 8% was international. In June and July of 2021, this number jumped incredibly into an international market. And at least from what we understand, what we were looking at often, monthly, looking at our data, is that it was fairly consistent with data that we were seeing in the census, and that's been historically true. And then when changes happened as a result of COVID or race issues across the country, for example, we saw some of those similar patterns happen in our screening data. An example is that during certain summer months in 2020, we saw an increased rise in anxiety taken among Asian American screeners, for example. This really just goes to show that we're sitting on a number of individuals, a large number of individuals who are coming to the internet and turning to the websites that we're developing for help. We know that the people who come on often also track young, they have high severity and no previous care. So as part of MHA's work and trying to understand how to reach people as early as we can, this scope of work fits under that bucket of work, right? So 77% of people who are scoring for moderate to severe issues have no prior treatment at home, or 60% don't have any treatment. And they're turning to the internet for the first time, not just to ask questions like, what is going on in my mind? Many people have low health literacy. They feel high rates of ambivalence about what to do next. And that makes sense, because when we're first struggling with a mental health condition, especially ones where you have abnormal experiences, maybe you're hearing voices or you have a change of your sense of reality, we know that it just takes a little bit of time for people to make sense of what's happening for themselves and to find a meaning or a label in there that works for them. When we also used to historically ask, what were people going to do? there was a lot of debate in our office about what people might like. And a lot of people felt that because of the urgency that was here, there was an argument about we needed to get people into clinics as soon as possible, get people access to therapists, et cetera, et cetera. There was a whole nother camp who said, I don't think that's the case. I think people are gonna wanna spend a bit of time on the internet looking for information, doing things by themselves. And that is definitely how the data played out. 50% of the entire population, when asked what they wanted to do, chose DIY tools, chose things that gave them a lot of control and a sense of control in this space during a time when things probably felt quite chaotic. And we see this finding similar with other technology groups that we talk to who are in an online space, looking for ways to understand and tap into supporting the people that we see online. This also plays out. We do have some data. Desmond talked about natural language, and it's so important because when you have data from 1 million people every year, or now 2.5 million people every year, we ask people open-ended questions like, what's going on for your life? Or what do you think you're going to do? People are willing to type in comments. And for a data perspective, this kind of natural language is so useful. Historically, we hadn't always had the technology to help us work through the data and understand what it could mean and how to collate the data in a meaningful way that helped us build out these resources. This is, I think, what the power of technology that we're sitting on today does allow us to do. And so as part of the work, we're looking for building on the data that we have, but working with groups of people that can help us interpret and understand that data and into a meaningful way so that we can then feed it back into a loop that builds on technology and resources that we can give people. The other side of the coin for us around leaning into technology is because we all come from the current mental health system of care. MHA is a consumer lived experience organization. Many of us as staff have tried multiple times throughout our lives, often as early as 8 generally, until our older age, trying to access care, have children who also then need to access care. And we know that many people aren't able to access care. I mean, 50% of Americans will experience some kind of mental health condition in their lifetime. And we know from federal data that we do also track that 55 receive no care. Like even when you're trying to look for it, it's very hard to get. Whoa, that's lights. As part of our work with Microsoft and with Desmond, we're also really wrestling with this idea of building equitable AI into systems, right? So you've seen some of the reports that we have here for the AI for Accessibility project. For MHA, when we think about how to make sure that we build in equity into our technology, we're asking ourselves if the processes that we have from beginning to end are inclusive, are they representative? Is the product that we're creating responsive? Meaning, can I take data in and make sure that it changes in response to the data instead of being static? Are we building something that creates sustainable material systemic change? Meaning, we know that there are problems that exist in community. Is what we're creating filling a gap that is meaningful in a real way for people on the ground? And then finally, are we harming communities? Because we know that as part of technology, if you built technology in white-centric communities, or if you don't think about inclusion or representation, that oftentimes these technologies have harmful impacts. And if that's the case, we have to ask ourselves whether we pause or roll back on something in order to make sure that we're doing no harm for people. Co-designing research has been really important. So a part of this AI for Accessibility grant that we have, it really also stems from a lot of the research that MHA has been advocating for across the years through PCORI, for example, right? So if you're looking for ways to think about the theories that you build on for your research, looking at concepts around patient participatory research or community participatory research are those words that we as a consumer group learned and onboarded to combine what we were thinking about as people who live with mental health conditions and figure out how we can enter this space to work with researchers. And at least from what we've come to learn is that the best products are created with people who live with disabilities or live with mental health conditions from the very beginning, right? It's okay if somebody asks us to review something after it's done. The best thing to do is to actually design something from beginning to end. So this means that people living with mental health conditions are there when we develop ideas, are there when we design the research itself, and we are designing the product. We are reviewing the findings. We are giving guidance on how to change the product, how to change the research if change is needed in the middle, and then we're reviewing and then we see that final product. And when you have that in its entirety, it's really awesome, because then you feel like, okay, I've actually created something that I know really is meaningful for community. So something is done with you and not to you or at you, which we know often happens in the mental health community. From a digital space, the examples of the way we do this is making sure that you feed your system first with the data that you have. Then we we constantly take interviews of individuals, processing through difficult conversations or questions. Like an interview in a focus group is best to work through complex ideas, like how do we handle or understand, conceptualize trauma, grief. I mean, you see Desmond's work and he's honing in on smaller communities, unpacking these complex ideas. But when you go to implement them, crowdsourcing material is something that we've learned is interesting, a bit like a thing that we can now do to gather input from as many people as you can into a space. And that is where I think social media as a platform allows for collecting information in a crowdsourced way to feed a system so that it can learn and grow in itself, which I think is the roots of artificial intelligence, right? And it's like super cool. But this could be in spaces like not focus groups, forums that we know that we're all in, anywhere where large numbers of people gather and are providing information so that you can take that information and learn from it. As part of our research, these are the philosophies that we brought to the table. So I'm working with the University of Toronto and I'm working with Northwestern University to co-design a texting support. So we knew people were turning to, an app is actually a really hard thing to do when you're struggling with your mental health issue. We all have too many apps and we only open them once. Most apps drop off in engagement within two weeks, actually. But people text, and if you receive a text, we can basically find you maybe anywhere. So the real cool thing about this is we knew sometimes we were reading content in the middle of our bedtime, on the toilet, honestly. Like, when do you just go to the internet? And if you received a text, like, would you engage with that text? So we really thought that this was the best way to find people in the moment where they're at. And we designed this research project based on that capability. As part of this research, Northwestern built in the co-design process we talked about. We were like, it's very important for you to use our data as a background for this, but then we need you to actively recruit from our network. You cannot go to schools, colleges where this is not our network. Our network is low income. They're all over the country. They're rural. These are people who don't have access to resources. They need a free resource. This is the hardest because people want to come and offer products, but the products are often costly. And for us, it was just like that has to be not one of the things. We have to be able to give a free, ubiquitous resource that's available for anyone, anywhere, using technology that's lower cost. So we can start helping people right away without these barriers that we know are problematic in our system. I'm going to slip this slide. If you want to read it, you can. This is basically some of the findings that the team learned about what they were going in. A lot of it was reinforcing. It was a validation of the large data we had given them. So it was cool. They were like, oh, we did this second survey, found out that yes, what you were finding was true. They wanted a digital technology. They wanted something simple. This fed, again, our hypothesis was X. Then we would validate it with the research and absolutely found, hey, this is what people want. They want a simple tool. They want it to help them work on their own time responding to their own motivations and their own needs. They did not want to feel forced into a system that took them on some ride, as opposed to feeling like they had a lot of control in the situation. Oops, sorry about that background. And then what we started to build in was this automated design process where we started to throw things. I mean, this is an example of what technology can give you, right? We started experimenting with the kinds of messages, the kinds of content strategies that existed. We experimented with stories and prompts, like, what do you say to someone when they're at different places? What kinds of questions and control can you give to people? And how do you frame this so that it makes the most sense for individuals? And this was all done in a co-design process, meaning people living with mental health conditions were here talking to the research team about what we thought could help us in this context, which was really, really cool. And then the wild part of it, I'm going to go back, is the AI part. And I'll have to acknowledge that as like a social worker / person living with mental health, like probably the computer science and AI part is the most confusing part for me. I'm just like, so a machine does something. And it's been really, really cool to work with computer science teams who are like, okay, if you give us this is the way we can massage this information and basically get the kinds of user feedback that will help create a product that will be even better. And that means this is the way he explained it to me. He was like, if you find out that participant X who's using the texting tool only likes to text at 10 p.m., the algorithm will learn that that's their preferred time. And that's when they're going to start bugging them, so that there's not a misalignment in terms of when I want the stuff I want, right? Which I was like, that is just wild to me, and so amazing that technology can do that for us now. We're also checking metrics. I would like to think that having a co-design process from the get-go led to better results. And the signals from what we see is that 86% of respondents do reply at least once a day. Their 79% are writing prompts, which are really higher. They're like, I have to type a story into it. So it's not like I'm giving a thumbs up emoji, I'm actually engaging with the tool. They're clicking through to the links we give them, reading content. And it seems like people are engaging. And for us, this is why we were like, okay, we tried this pilot and it's very exciting that it seems to be working. So we're like, let's keep going and test with more and more people. And that's really the goal, is to get this out to as many people as we can. And so we're about to deploy a test for 5,000 people. Next year, that should be more. I think we were talking about 10. And then ideally, the future for MHA is actually to deploy this to our entire population, which is 2.6 US to 5 million international users every year, right? So this is the next step of our work, to expand our content, make sure there's more content there, build it to scale. How do we do this for as many people as we see are coming to the website, and make sure that it can continue to use technology to personalize these tools to that individual themselves. I'm not going to play this, but it's just an audio of people who've said, this is some of the feedback we receive from research participants who've been a part of it, and some of their thoughts about how cool it is. So unless, I don't know if Desmond and Wendy, do you guys want to come back? Should I play this audio? I think it's like 30, let me see. Oh, okay.
We can't hear it.
Oh, you can't hear it?
It's probably, you have your headphones in, maybe that's the issue.
Oh,
Yeah, it's not coming across.
Can't hear it. We'll have to share it. Maybe online we'll share it, and then we'll send a link to all of our people who have registered for this webinar so you can hear the audio clip. It's really, really cool. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Put the link in the file.
I'm also going to mute myself because I'm in the middle of what sounds like construction, which sounds pretty weird. So
Great. Well, we have plenty of time for Q&A. So like I mentioned, people are welcome to go ahead and submit questions through the chat box. We have a few to get started with already. Teresa, the first one is for you. Does MHA's data show that people want to explore resources for self-help because of the shame attached to asking and reaching out for help?
Yeah, I think there's shame of reaching out to ask for help. There's also shame, I don't know if I would call it shame. It's like confusion, you know, the first time you hear that maybe you have Crohn's or even cancer, everybody has a grieving process. And sometimes we, in the mental health treatment community, we want to rush that process. We want to rush the grief instead of leaning into the grief and understanding that is part of that process. And so for us, we see a lot of that. It's like confusion. I don't know what's happening. I'm not sure I believe it. Bargaining, maybe it's something else, you know? Anger, like we get a lot of F-bombs. I think that's anger, right? It's like, nah, like I'm just mad. So that's probably from what in the natural language evaluation, to us, it's the building of health literacy and the grief of new information that you're dealing with in life.
And a more general question for everyone, how do you guys hope to see tech advances change the landscape of mental health treatment in the future?
You know, I would love to see us develop treatments that are within the digital environment. So much of what's being communicated, so much that's being engaged is happening within digital environments, and yet lots of our treatments are still offline. I think that having a mix of treatments that are inclusive of the digital environment is going to be really important as we move forward.
And it's also important that we're also getting people away from computers too, because that can be a contributor to your mental health, right? And so I think there is a nice balance, and I think that's anyway, something else to consider. I've been glad to hear some of the folks at Microsoft. There's a whole bunch of folks doing research in the employee experience, and especially in these hybrid environments, and especially in the last year, it can be really hard to get away from your devices too. So good uses of it, I absolutely agree, but also those uses that'll encourage you to get away from it.
The only thing I will add is to that, you know, in mental health, we have this saying that you should meet people where they are at. And where are people at? Sometimes we don't ask that question enough. Where in the world are you at? Your location, where in your mind space are you at? Can you attend to this issue right now? Are we creating tools that don't match up with your need, you know? And how does technology built in that way, why is it that technology and apps don't work? Like, why do people leave? And is it because we're not creating? I would say there are two things. We're not creating technology that's engaging people in the right way, and digital timelines are different. So therapeutic timelines exist in like 4 to 8 week span. A lot of the research requires that much time to find evidence of effectiveness. But in a technological space, I argue that we need to shorten windows and expand them. And that means my interventions happen in small micro times, but people also drop and come back into technology. So if my research window only occurs in 4 weeks and somebody comes back later in like 3 months, I'm not capturing that outcome, right? Like, so I'm not meeting people where they're at, or using what I know, how we use spaces and learning and technology to think correctly about how to meet people where they're at.
Great point. How can technology be used to help people better identify what their needs are and the root causes of what they're struggling with?
I think the beauty of, in particular, social media is that it allows you to see the multiplicity of selves that we all have, right? And so I may present a school self, a family self, an aspirational self that might be filled with things that aren't necessarily true, but are true to me, or I hope to have, right? And so by understanding that there's so much in terms of the versatility of how we present ourselves online and how that can be used to actually support people and to identify resources and needs, I think is an under-tapped space.
Yeah, the undertapped complexity of the human condition, I think, is what technology gives you. So if I think about, for example, as a consumer, I can think about relationship problems. But if I go online and if I go to a clinic, so much of the way we do evidence-based practices funnel that into a narrow space. But if I go to TikTok, or if I go to YouTube, or I go to the internet, I see the whole world of research relationship problems like spread out for me in a way that it boggles my mind. I'm like, gosh, what if I had had this at 12? What if I had worked out my relationship problems at 12 so that I didn't basically carry this into my life at my 20s and now at my 40s? Like, I would probably be a healthier human being. And I'm like, that is the coolest thing about technology, is the democratization of experiences. And I'm like, wow, how do we help people navigate that space? It's so amazing.
Totally. No, I think that's one of the interesting things to come out of COVID. Experiences like this, like we're not traveling to have this webinar, right? I'm not traveling anymore to meet with some of my support groups, right? And I'm now connecting with people who are having similar lived experiences to me all over the world. And whereas that used to be me meeting with a group of people, 10 people in a room, I'm now hearing from 15 people around the world. And that impact of knowing that people are, no matter what country you're in, mental health experiences are pretty similar, has been so mind-blowing for me in this last year, that I think that has helped me in my healing journey just leaps and bounds. So I think when we talk about technology and mental health, we need to include all of these aspects of it, right? It's not just AI, it's this, it's connection and all the many forms that we're able to see now.
All right, and that's all we have for specific questions. We have a few minutes left if any of you have any last words or thoughts that you didn't get to during the presentation that you'd like to bring up.
And for people who might be non-readers and want to hear, Gary talks about how he says, it is personally insulting to know that I can't do it myself anymore. Additional mental health care workers could help over months showing a patient how to use technology and get comfortable. We see this a lot. I mean, working right now with California on implementing innovative technology for people. And what they didn't do is didn't talk to people, and they deployed all these tools and then had to backtrack because they realized, oh my gosh, people, they want guidance. They also want to do this with someone to help them understand technology and the way technology can work in their lives. And this was done through peer support. I thought it was so cool. And then Renee talks about going to YouTube. 100%. I say, you actually, YouTube has become a really interesting search engine for people looking for answers for mental health issues. Desmond, you work in social media. Do you have any final thoughts for people who are thinking of social media as a context for how to reach out or help people?
Yeah, I think it's such an important context. I can't reiterate that. And I really appreciate Wendy's points of saying, of really underscoring the importance of a balance in how we leverage the digital space as well. But I think that there is room for, at least as a bare minimum, additional questions about the social media environment when working with patients and clients and communities that give us deeper insights as to how they're affected by social media, or what's the promise of social media. Because as we know, we have different communities that are using social media in really promising and promotive ways that we want to learn about, but we also understand that there are lots of harms that probably we all have experienced or observed in some way as well. But if we don't have a body of questionnaires like we have in psychology and social work and psychiatry, I haven't seen that evidence-based, tech-based questionnaire yet that folks could use and engage. And so it might be worth people coming together to think about what those needs might be as well.
And Wendy, I could see you giving final thoughts about the future of AI for accessibility and for Microsoft. or even just what you're excited about to see in the future to close
Well, I'm
us
most
out
excited to see what you all are going to do. I got to say that's a close part of my job is just, you know, helping you all do good stuff. So I'm very excited about both of your projects. I'm also just I don't know, it's interesting. I'm in a place right now where I have both a lot of excitement and I have both a lot of fear. You know, I think we're seeing some AI happening so quickly without co-design. And I think there's a lot of perpetuation of bias. However, I'm also seeing a lot of conversations like this, and I know that there's change happening. We just need to make sure that we're infusing this quick advancement with these good principles. And so I'm hopeful that AI can really help, and technology in general can really help us build a more equitable society.
Awesome. Really wonderful and important work all around. So we'll wrap there. Thank you, Wendy, Desmond, and Teresa for sharing such valuable information today. I'll be in touch with everyone in the next few days with the recording, slides, and the link to request your certificate of attendance. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you.